The station was called Concordance Prime. It floated at the center of neutral space, a massive ring of silver and glass that caught starlight and threw it back in all directions. 23 alien species had built it together, 200 years ago, as a place where no war could be declared and no weapon could be drawn. It was supposed to be the most peaceful place in the galaxy. Junho had been here 3 times before. He knew the corridors, the smell of recycled air mixed with alien biology, the sound of dozens of languages bouncing off the high ceilings. He had spent 22 years learning how to move through spaces like this, how to smile without showing teeth because some species read it as aggression, how to keep his hands visible, how to speak slowly and wait. He was good at waiting. He walked into the Grand Spire wearing a dark blue diplomatic uniform with the flag of Earth stitched over his left breast. Beside him, Ara moved quickly to keep up with his long stride, her translation earpiece already running. She was 31 years old and had learned 6 alien languages in 4 years. Junho trusted her more than almost anyone. "You nervous?" she asked him quietly. "No," he said. "Liar," she said. He smiled. It was a real smile, not a diplomatic one. The chamber was enormous. The ceiling was so high it was almost invisible, lost in shadow above them. 23 curved balconies rose around a central floor, each one belonging to a different species. Human representatives had been given a standing platform near the base, below the main seating. That had always bothered Junho, but he had never said so out loud. Today was the day it would change. The Galactic Council session opened with ceremony, long, alien ceremony that Ara translated in a low voice for the other members of the small human delegation. Speeches were given. History was recited. The vote was framed as a momentous occasion, a step forward for galactic unity. Junho listened to all of it and kept his hands clasped behind his back and his expression polite and open and said nothing. Then the vote happened. Ara counted quietly in Junho's ear, 12 in favor, 10 against, 1 abstaining. Humanity had the threshold. The delegation behind Junho let out a breath they had been holding for 40 years. Junho kept his face still. He had learned long ago that the moment you celebrate is the moment something goes wrong. He was right. The Veldrath High Speaker stood. He was tall, covered in dark scaled plates, and he moved with the kind of slow deliberateness that large predators use when they are not in a hurry. His name was something that required 2 mouths to pronounce properly. In diplomatic circles, he was simply called the Speaker. He raised one long arm and invoked the right of sovereign refusal. Junho had read about this law. It was so old that most species had assumed it was decorative, a relic of an earlier, uglier era of council politics. It allowed a member species, under certain conditions, to block the admission of a new civilization by declaring them a threat to galactic culture. It had never been used, not once in 200 years. The speaker used it now. He spoke for 6 minutes in his own language, and Ara translated every word into Junho's ear. The words were careful and formal and completely hollow. They said humanity was violent, primitive, that their biological aggression made them unfit to sit beside civilized races, that their diplomat stood before the council not as a representative of a worthy civilization, but as proof of how far some life forms had yet to evolve. The words were not improvised. They were prepared. Every sentence landed in exactly the right order, rehearsed and deliberate. Junho listened to all of it without moving. Then the speaker said one more thing, and Ara stopped translating. "Ara," Junho said very quietly. Her voice, when it came, was carefully controlled. "He says that you have been found guilty of cultural contamination. He says the sentence is immediate." Junho turned his head slightly and looked at her. "Run," he said. The Veldrath enforcers came from 3 directions at once. They moved fast, much faster than beings their size should have been able to move. 2 of them had Junho by the arms before he could take a step backward. Two more formed a wall between the human delegation and the chamber floor, blocking the path forward with bodies that were nearly twice the width of a human frame. The third raised a plasma emitter. Ara did not run at first. She froze, the way people do when something happens that their brain refuses to process as real. She saw Junho look up at the high ceiling of the grand spire, as though he were looking at the sky through it, at something beyond it. She saw his hands open, fingers spread wide, completely still at his sides. He did not struggle. He did not shout. He stood with the same steady posture he had carried into every difficult room in 22 years of service. The emitter fired. Everything after that was noise and light and the horrible smell of burning, and then there were hands on Ara's arms, not rough hands, careful and gentle ones, pulling her backward through a side door she hadn't known was there. The door closed. The sounds became muffled. She was in a narrow service corridor, cold and dark and smelling of machine oil and dust. Standing beside her was a small, pale figure in a gray robe, an Orani delegate. His name was a soft clicking sound that human mouths couldn't reproduce cleanly. His 4 small eyes were wet, and his thin mandibles trembled with what Ara recognized, even through her shock, as distress. "I am sorry," he said in careful but clear standard speech. "I am so sorry, please come with me. There is a way out." She went with him. She could not feel her legs properly. She went anyway. The Orani led her through 3 service corridors and 2 maintenance hatches, and into a small docking bay that smelled like engine exhaust and old machinery. There was a single shuttle there, civilian markings, Orani registry, nothing about it that would attract attention from a security sweep. 2 of the Orani's staff were already inside. No questions were asked. No one looked at Ara with anything other than quiet urgency. The shuttle left the station before any docking lockdown could be put in place, slipping out through a freight exit on the far side of the ring. Ara sat in the back of the shuttle and stared at the wall. The Orani delegate sat across from her and said nothing. He understood that there was nothing useful to say. The shuttle moved through open space in silence. She was not crying. She didn't understand why she was not crying. She thought maybe it would come later. The broadcast had already gone out. Every recording drone in the chamber had captured everything from multiple angles. Within 4 minutes of Junho's death, the footage was already traveling across the relay network at maximum speed, jumping from station to station, heading toward every inhabited system in the galaxy without pause or filter or any way to stop it. It reached Earth in a little under 3 hours. Secretary General Insu was in his private office when his senior aide placed a tablet on the desk in front of him without a word. The aide's face said everything before the footage began. Insu watched it once all the way through. Then he watched it a second time. Then he placed the tablet face down on the desk and sat very still for a long moment, his hands flat on the surface, looking at nothing. He was 64 years old. He had been in public service for 38 of those years. He had given more speeches about peace than he could count. He had bent rules and swallowed insults and smiled through diplomatic ceremonies that lasted 12 hours because humanity needed allies and allies needed to be courted carefully and patiently and without visible anger. He believed in all of that. He had built his career on all of that. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked down the hall to the war room. The people inside already knew. They had all seen the footage. Every face in the room was carrying it differently, some white with shock, some tight with rage, some completely blank in the way that deep anger sometimes looks like calm. Commander Murray stood at the head of the main table with her hands flat on its surface, looking at the star map mounted on the far wall. She did not look up when Insu entered. He stopped in the middle of the room. Every face turned toward him. He spoke 4 words. They were not angry words. They were not loud. They came out in the same calm, level tone he used to open budget meetings and address school assemblies and greet foreign dignitaries after long flights. That calm was the most frightening thing in the room. It was the calm of a decision already made, and a direction already chosen, and nothing left to debate. No more asking nicely. The room was silent for exactly 1 second. Then everyone started working. The galaxy waited for humanity to scream. That was what species did when something like this happened. They broadcast their grief on every channel. They issued long declarations of outrage. They demanded justice in formal language that echoed across relay networks for weeks. They sent delegations and held emergency sessions and made speeches that were passionate and expensive and ultimately accomplished very little. It was the established pattern of galactic politics. Something terrible happened. The injured party made noise, and the noise eventually quieted into negotiation. Earth made no noise. For the first 24 hours after Junho's death, every human diplomatic channel went completely dark. No transmissions left Earth's communication networks. No statements were issued. No ambassadors contacted anyone. The human representatives stationed at various galactic outposts disappeared quietly into their quarters and did not come out. The lights in human embassy buildings stayed on, but no one appeared at windows or doors or communication terminals. The Galactic Council issued a formal statement expressing regret over what it carefully called an incident during the admission proceedings. The statement was long enough to look serious and empty enough to commit to nothing. It did not name the Veldrath. It did not describe what had actually happened. It used words like unfortunate and regrettable, the way someone uses a small piece of cloth to cover a very large wound. No one from Earth responded. At the 48-hour mark, the Veldrath High Speaker gave a public address in which he called Junho's death a necessary exercise of Council authority and warned that humanity's aggression would continue to be a problem for galactic stability. He spoke with the confidence of someone who believed the worst was already behind him. Several Council species issued politely worded statements suggesting that all parties should pursue calm dialogue and peaceful resolution. Earth said nothing. The silence was more frightening than any declaration of war would have been, and most species did not understand why until much later. A species that screams when it is hurt is telling you where the pain is. A species that goes completely quiet is doing something else. It is deciding. On the 72nd hour, Secretary General Insu walked into the emergency session of the United Earth Council. The chamber was full. Every seat was taken by someone who had served in either government or military command for at least a decade. There were no observers, no press, no recording equipment of any kind. The room was so quiet that the sound of the heavy door closing behind Insu carried clearly to every corner. He sat at the head of the table and looked around the room once. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to hear from Director Tiho." Tiho stood. He was a lean man with gray at his temples and eyes that had the particular flatness of someone who had spent too many years reading intelligence reports about things that had already gone wrong. He had run the Human Intelligence Bureau for 11 years. He had contacts in 7 alien governments. He had, in theory, been humanity's first warning system against exactly this kind of situation. He placed both hands on the table and looked at Insu directly. "We had indicators," he said, "movement patterns in the Veldrath diplomatic corps over the past 4 months, unusual communications traffic in the weeks before the vote. I assessed the probability of a hostile action during the admission session at 12%. He paused. The room was completely still. "I did not believe they would move against a diplomat in an open chamber in front of every recording drone on the station. That was a failure of my imagination, not my data. The failure is mine." No one spoke. Insu looked at him steadily for a moment. "We'll discuss accountability when this is finished," he said. "Sit down." Tiho sat. Commander Murray stood next. She was tall and broad-shouldered and carried herself with the physical stillness of someone who had spent decades commanding large ships through dangerous space. She had served in the Earth Navy for 31 years and had not slept in 2 days, though you could not tell that by looking at her. She walked to the main display without ceremony and brought up the star map. What appeared first was the standard configuration, Earth's official naval strength, the numbers filed with the Galactic Council as part of the admission process, the fleet that every alien intelligence service had assessed and catalogued and considered in their calculations. It was a modest force, roughly 200 warships spread across several defensive positions, exactly the kind of military that a young, peaceful civilization seeking council membership would be expected to maintain. Then she pressed a second control. The display updated. The room went very still in a different way than it had been still before. 812 warships appeared on the map. They were positioned differently from the official configuration, not in defensive arrangements but in forward positions, sitting in outer systems and inside installations that no alien intelligence service had ever classified as anything other than civilian. A deep space mining operation at the edge of the Kepler belt turned out to be a fully armed forward base with dry dock facilities capable of servicing a fleet of 40 vessels. A research station near the Outer Rim colonies was a weapons testing site. 14 commercial cargo transport lines were armed troop carriers that had been moving freely through galactic space for years without a second look from anyone. Humanity had been building its real military for 15 years, quietly, behind a carefully maintained false one. "We anticipated," Murray said, in a voice that carried no particular emotion, "that there would come a moment when being underestimated would be our most valuable asset." No one in the room seemed surprised, which meant that the right people over the years had known. That was also part of the plan. The session lasted 6 hours. Every decision made in the 6 hours was unanimous. There were no long arguments, no procedural delays, no factions pulling in different directions, no one requesting time to consult their advisors. Humanity in that room moved with the terrible efficiency of people who had spent 40 years being patient and had now finished being patient. They were a single thing with a single direction, and they moved the way heavy objects move, not fast at first, but with a momentum that does not stop once it begins. Ara arrived on Earth on the 41st hour. She had slept for 9 of the past 41 and had eaten twice only because the Orani delegate had stood over her with food until she had complied, saying nothing, simply waiting with quiet patience that she recognized and hated and was grateful for. She walked off the arrival shuttle and directly into a secure briefing room where Insu and Murray and Tiho were waiting. She sat down across from them. No one offered pleasantries or asked about her journey. "Tell us everything," Insu said. She told them everything. She spoke for 2 hours without notes, without pausing, without being interrupted once. Her voice stayed flat and precise throughout. She described the chamber. She described the vote and the sound the delegation made when the threshold was reached. She described the speaker rising. She described the exact words he used and the order he used them in. She described the enforcers and the emitter and Junho standing still with his hands open and his face turned upward. She described the smell. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long time. Tiho was looking at the table in front of him. Murray was looking at the wall. Insu was looking at Ara with the steady, careful attention he gave to things that mattered. "Thank you," he said. "What are we going to do?" she asked. "You will know in 31 hours, he said. At the exact 72nd hour, a transmission went out from Earth on every available channel at once, every relay frequency, every diplomatic band, every open network that signals could travel. It reached Concordance Prime in 3 hours. It reached the outer Veldrath systems in 9. It reached every inhabited system in the galaxy within 22 hours, running on automatic relays that had been set up and tested and waiting for weeks. Insu appeared on screen. He was wearing the black uniform of the Earth Defense Council, not the white diplomatic dress he had worn for every public appearance in the past decade. His face was calm, not sad. Not angry, calm in the deep, settled way of someone who has finished deciding and is now simply doing. He spoke for 47 seconds. He did not threaten anyone. He did not demand anything. He did not call for justice or express grief or ask for cooperation or explain humanity's position or offer an opportunity for negotiation. He simply stated in plain and basic language what was going to happen. He used the future tense throughout, consistently and without variation. Not "we are considering action." Not "we may respond if provoked further." Every sentence described something that was already decided and already in motion, and was going to happen whether anyone else had opinions about it or not. He thanked no one. He addressed no specific species or body. He ended the transmission without a formal closing. Across the galaxy, translators scrambled to find a word in their own languages for what humanity was projecting from every channel simultaneously. Some found words for anger. Some found words for grief or resolve or threat. Their colleagues reviewed the translations and shook their heads and tried again. None of those words were quite right. The Orani delegate who had pulled Ara through the service corridor and into the shuttle watched the transmission from a station near the Orani home system. When it ended, he sat quietly for a long moment. Then he turned to his aide and said something in his own language that translated, roughly, as, "They have already decided. They are not telling us what they want. They are telling us what will happen." His aide asked if that was frightening. He thought about it carefully. "Yes," he said, "but I think it was always going to come to this. I think the only thing the Veldrath changed was the date." Across 23 civilizations, translators kept searching their language banks and reference libraries for the right word. Most of them eventually settled on something that meant, in their own tongue, certainty. The fleet moved without announcement. There was no final ultimatum sent, no warning broadcast, no countdown transmitted to Veldrath border stations. Insu had said what was going to happen in 47 seconds of transmission, and now it was happening, and the only communication the Veldrath received was the kind that showed up on long-range sensors as a wall of moving objects that had not been there the day before. Admiral Kangho commanded the first expeditionary fleet from the bridge of the UENS Undying Soul, the largest warship humanity had ever built. It was a Titan-class dreadnought, 700 meters long, constructed in the hidden dockyard inside the Kepler Outer installation over 6 years, and never publicly acknowledged until 4 days before the fleet moved. There were 2 other ships like it in the fleet. Most alien intelligence services that were currently trying to rapidly reassess humanity's military capability didn't know any of the 3 existed. Kangho was 57 years old and had commanded ships since he was 29. He was not a loud man. He did not give speeches on the bridge or pace dramatically while reading battle reports. He sat in the command chair with a cup of cold coffee and thought, and when he had finished thinking, he gave orders in a quiet and specific voice, and the people around him carried those orders out without needing them repeated. The fleet he commanded contained 340 warships. This was not all of Earth's new military strength, but it was enough. Enough had been Murray's specific word during the planning sessions, repeated with the quiet emphasis of someone who had done the math carefully several times and was not guessing. The Veldrath had been fighting wars for 400 years. They were a warrior culture in the truest sense. Conflict was woven into their politics, their religion, and the way they organized their social structures from the ground up. They had fought 11 major interstellar wars in recorded history and won 9 of them. Their fleet was large and experienced and disciplined, and they believed, with the comfortable certainty of a species that had never met a real surprise on a battlefield, that they understood what war looked like and how it worked. They did not understand what was coming. 2 days before reaching Veldrath border space, the first fleet split into 6 independent strike groups. Each group had a specific target, not a specific enemy ship to destroy, a specific function to take apart. Group 1 was assigned the primary communications relay network. Group 2 targeted supply chain infrastructure. Group 3 moved against the command and coordination vessels at the center of the border fleet formation. Group 4 hit the jump relay stations that allowed rapid communication across the border systems. Group 5 was equipped and trained for boarding. Group 6 held in reserve and waited. Captain Yuna received her orders for the Undying Soul at 4 in the morning ship time. She read them twice, confirmed receipt, and briefed her senior officers in the ship's forward conference room while most of her crew was still sleeping. She was 39 years old and had been in the Navy for 16 years. She had the kind of face that was very difficult to read under stress, which was one of the main reasons she had risen to command as fast as she had. "Our job," she told her officers, "is to be seen. The soul goes forward and draws attention while the strike groups work around us. We are not the fist in this fight. We are the face they watch while the fist moves." One of her officers asked what they were supposed to do if the Veldrath focused all their fire on the soul. Yuna looked at him. "We are a Titan-class dreadnought," she said. "We survive it." The engagement began at 6 in the morning when Group 1 severed the primary relay hub in the outer Veldrath system with a precision strike that took 11 seconds and disabled 4 relay towers without destroying them. The communications blackout across the border region was immediate. Veldrath fleet commanders who had been talking to each other freely across a wide network suddenly could not. They began trying to compensate. They started repositioning. This was expected. The Undying Soul dropped out of its approach vector and appeared directly in front of the largest concentration of Veldrath warships. 40 vessels arranged in a defensive formation that had been standard Veldrath military doctrine for 200 years. The formation was designed for a head-on fight. It put maximum firepower forward and assumed that any enemy would approach from one direction at a time. The strike groups did not approach from one direction. While the Veldrath fleet commander was watching the soul and bringing his weapons to bear on the single massive target in front of him, Groups 2, 3, and 4 were already operating in different parts of the system simultaneously, moving at angles that the Veldrath tactical computers could not track fast enough while also managing the immediate threat of the dreadnought in their face. Group 2 found the supply convoy at the edge of the system and disabled it in 12 minutes. Group 3 located the command vessel, a large, heavily marked ship that was the tactical brain of the entire border fleet, and hit its engines and communications array with targeted, careful fire. The command ship did not explode. It went dark and still, alive inside but completely unable to direct anything. Group 4 destroyed 2 jump relay stations in rapid succession, further closing off the Veldrath ability to call for help or coordinate with ships outside the system. The Veldrath border fleet commander had been in combat 41 times. He had won 38 of those engagements. He had never felt what he felt in the next 90 minutes, which was the specific and deeply unpleasant sensation of watching a battle move in a direction you can clearly see but cannot stop no matter how fast you react, because every reaction you make was already planned for. The Undying Soul took fire, significant fire from multiple ships at once. Yuna stood at the command console and watched the shield readings climb and called out adjustments to the helm in the same flat, practical tone that other people used to read out a grocery list. The ship shook twice from direct impacts on the hull. One secondary battery went offline. A cooling pipe ruptured in the lower engineering section. None of it mattered in the way it needed to matter to change anything. Then Group 5 moved in. The boarding action was the part that confused the Veldrath most, because they had not imagined it as a possibility. Human boarding teams, fast, fully armored, operating in coordinated units of 8, hit 12 Veldrath vessels at the same moment through pressurized entry points that the teams had spent months training to locate and cut through. The objective was not to kill the crews. The objective was to secure the ships. Within 3 hours, 12 Veldrath vessels had their living crews locked in their own cargo holds, sitting in the dark, while the ships drifted under human control. Kang Ho had been very clear about this in his briefing before the fleet moved. He had stood at the front of the planning room and said it once, without particular drama, and it had stayed with everyone who heard it. "We don't make martyrs," he had said, "we make messengers." The total engagement lasted 6 hours and 4 minutes. At the end of it, the Veldrath border fleet was not a destroyed fleet. It was a disassembled one, taken apart with the methodical precision of an engineer who knows exactly which piece to remove to make the whole machine stop, and removes only that piece. Ships were disabled rather than vaporized wherever it was possible. Weapons were neutralized rather than detonated. Personnel were secured rather than killed. Of the 40 Veldrath ships in the main formation, 31 were captured or disabled. 6 had managed to retreat into jump. 3 had been destroyed, not because human ships chose to destroy them, but because their commanders had decided to overload their own reactors rather than allow their vessels to be boarded. Kang Ho noted this in his report without commentary. It was a piece of information. He filed it as such. Chief Science Officer Hayen's resonance disruptors, deployed from 3 strike group vessels, had scrambled the electromagnetic systems of 9 Veldrath warships from 40,000 kilometers, leaving them dark and completely non-functional before a single conventional weapon was fired at them. The technology had worked beyond its projected parameters. Hayen, receiving the field report on Earth from her lab, read it twice and made a note and went back to work on the next problem. The captured Veldrath fleet commander was brought aboard the Undying Soul and placed in a secure room. He was not injured. He was large, his scales the dark coloring of senior military caste, and he sat across the table from Kang Ho with the flat, controlled stillness of a being that had spent its entire adult life in military service and was not going to show fear to a human in a quiet room. He asked, after a long silence, why humans had not simply destroyed his fleet. The question was not emotional. It was a genuine tactical question from someone trying to understand what he had just lost to. Kang Ho looked at him for a moment. "Because we want you to go home and tell them what you saw," he said. The commander was quiet for a while. "And what did I see?" he asked. Kang Ho considered the question. "The beginning," he said. The commander was released 2 days later in an escape pod positioned 200 kilometers from the nearest Allied station. He carried nothing with him, no formal message, no documentation, no demands or ultimatums of any kind. He carried only the detailed and precise memory of what he had witnessed over 6 hours and 4 minutes. A border fleet taken apart by an enemy that had not officially existed until 4 days prior. By methods no Veldrath military doctrine had prepared anyone to fight, executed with a calm that was more frightening than any rage would have been. The message he delivered when he arrived was not written in words. It was written in the shape of 31 vessels floating silent and dark and undestroyed in the space where his fleet had been, left there deliberately, left there to be seen. The Galactic Council was not supposed to be capable of chaos. It had rules for everything, rules for how to enter a session and how to leave one, rules for the order in which species could speak and the maximum length of each address, rules for what counted as a formal accusation and what counted as a casual statement of concern. 200 years of accumulated procedure had built a structure so dense and carefully layered that it was almost impossible for anything to move quickly inside it. That had always been the point. Slow process meant fewer wars. 3 weeks after the Battle of the Veldrath border, the Council was in chaos. It started with Director Tiho. He had spent the first 3 weeks of the war doing what he always did, gathering information, confirming sources, building a complete picture from small and separate pieces of data. He had failed once before this began, and the weight of that failure sat behind his eyes every morning when he arrived at his desk, and every night when he finally left it. He was not going to fail again. He worked without enough sleep for days at a stretch, delegated only what he had no choice but to delegate, and read every report himself before it moved anywhere. What he found was worse than what anyone had expected. The Veldrath High Speaker's decision to invoke the right of sovereign refusal had not been a sudden political move made in the heat of the moment. It had been planned for 14 months, and it had not been planned alone. 4 other council species had been involved in the planning: the Denari, the Kurath, the Solen, the Breath. They had provided political cover, coordinated their votes against human admission as part of a private arrangement, and shared intelligence about the timing of the ceremony. They claimed, in the communications Tiho now held complete copies of, that they had not known the Veldrath intended to execute Junho. They said they had believed the right of sovereign refusal would simply block humanity's admission and embarrass the delegation into withdrawing. The Veldrath had told them only what they needed to know. Whether that was fully true or completely false was almost irrelevant. They had helped build the trap. Their names were in the communications. The communications existed, and Tiho had all of them. On a Tuesday morning, without consulting anyone above him, he packaged the full document set and sent it simultaneously to every major galactic news network that would accept a transmission. He sent a brief message to Insu at the same moment explaining what he had done and why, and stating clearly that he accepted in advance whatever consequence Insu judged appropriate. Insu read the message. He looked out his office window for a long time at the gray sky outside. Then he sent 2 words back. "Good call." The reaction across the galaxy was immediate and enormous. The story appeared on every major network within hours, identical in its core facts regardless of where it was covered. 4 council species had secretly worked with the Veldrath to block human admission through a mechanism that had ended in the live public burning of a human diplomat. The footage of Junho's death, which had already been seen by virtually every sentient being in the known galaxy, ran again alongside the communication records. The context made everything worse. It turned what could have been read as one species' cruelty into something that looked, very clearly, like a coordinated decision made by 5. The Denari ambassador contacted Earth within hours of the first news cycle, requesting an emergency private channel. Insu made him wait 48 hours before acknowledging the request. The Kurath contacted Earth the same day with similar urgency. The Solen sent 3 increasingly anxious messages in the first 6 hours alone. The Breath went completely silent, which Tiho flagged in his notes as the most strategically interesting response of the 4. Silence from the Breath meant they were calculating, not panicking. He kept a close eye on them. When Insu finally responded to the Denari, it was in a written message, not a live channel. It was polite, brief, and offered nothing of substance. It said only that Earth was aware of their request and would address it at an appropriate time. There was no indication of when that time might be or what addressing it might involve. All 4 species understood, with the particular clarity that comes from being watched by an angry civilization that has just revealed a military 8 times larger than anyone had believed it had, that they were in a situation they needed to manage very carefully. On the floor of the Galactic Council chamber, something happened that had not happened in 300 years. The Orani collective's lead delegate rose at the formal podium during an open session and issued a species-level condemnation. Not a statement of concern, not an expression of regret over a difficult situation. A formal named condemnation of the Veldrath Dominion, citing the High Speaker by his full title, describing what had happened in plain and direct language, and naming Junho by name. 6 other species seconded the condemnation within the hour, then 2 more, then another. The Veldrath response to all of this showed, more clearly than anything else that had happened, how badly they had misread the situation from the beginning. They launched a military strike against Jeju Station. Jeju Station was one of humanity's outer colonies, a civilian platform housing roughly 40,000 people at the edge of human space. It was not a military installation. It had no significant defensive capability. The Veldrath chose it specifically, almost certainly because they believed that threatening a civilian population would force human warships to abandon their advance and rush back to defend, converting the war from an offensive operation into a reactive scramble. It was a tactic that had worked for them before, against other species in older wars. They understood it well. They did not understand who they were using it against. Kang Ho received the alert when the Veldrath Strike Force 43 warships was 6 hours out from Jeju Station. He had two options. He could pull ships from the main advance, which would slow momentum and reward the Veldrath gamble in a way they would learn from, or he could divert the Undying Soul. He chose the second without a long deliberation. Yuna received the new orders with 22 minutes to spare before she needed to be moving. She turned the Soul and its accompanying 8 vessels toward Jeju Station at maximum thrust, and said nothing to her crew beyond the factual coordinates and timeline. What followed became known as the Battle of Jeju Station. It lasted 11 hours, and it was the hardest engagement of the war. The Veldrath Strike Force was large enough and aggressive enough to be a genuine and serious threat, and they fought with a desperation that the Border Fleet had not shown, because the Border Fleet commanders had not understood what was happening until it was over, while these commanders understood perfectly and were fighting with everything they had. Yuna lost 14 ships over those 11 hours, 14 vessels and everyone aboard them, names that would be read aloud later in a ceremony on Earth. She fought without leaving the command deck and ate nothing and drank water twice when her second officer brought it to her without being asked. She made decisions continuously for 11 hours, the kind of decisions that have no perfect answer, which position to hold and which to give up, which ships to push forward and which to pull back, what to protect at what cost. At the 11th hour, the Veldrath force broke. 6 ships in the rear of their formation attempted a direct run at the station in a final push. The Undying Soul moved in front of them and ended it in 4 minutes. Jeju Station was unharmed. 40,000 people, most of whom had spent 11 hours watching the battle on external feed monitors, were fine. The footage from Yuna's bridge in the final minutes of the fight spread across the galaxy almost as widely as the footage of Junho's death had spread weeks before. They were very different kinds of footage, and people watched them for very different reasons. One showed the thing that had started the war, a man standing still with his hands open, while someone pointed a weapon at him. The other showed what the war looked like from inside. A young woman standing at a command console with no sleep and no time for anything except the next decision, holding a line that needed to be held. Back on Earth, on the same afternoon that Yuna was bringing the damaged Soul back toward the nearest dock for emergency repairs, a memorial was held for Junho. It was a quiet ceremony. His family sat in the front row, his wife, his 2 adult children, his elderly mother who had traveled from the coast. They were not asked to speak. Several officials gave brief remarks. Then Ara stood up at the front of the room. She had brought no notes. She spoke for 12 minutes. She talked about who Junho was before he was a diplomat, a secondary school teacher for 6 years, a man who cooked complicated meals on weekends because he found it calming, a father who had attended every school performance and sports event his children could remember even when it meant flying across the planet and back in the same day. She described his particular kind of patience, the way he could sit across from a hostile alien representative for 8 straight hours without once letting frustration enter his voice, not because he felt nothing, but because he understood that feeling it and showing it were different choices. She said that he believed, with complete sincerity and no embarrassment about it, that humanity's best possible future was one where they had genuine and equal friendships among the stars. Then she paused. He couldn't have known, she said, that the price of that future would be him. He would have paid it anyway. That was who he was, but we should never forget that someone paid it, that it cost something real and permanent and that we carry that. She sat down. The council vote to formally censure the Veldrath Dominion passed 19-2. The two votes against were cast by the Veldrath themselves. The margin told its own story about how completely the politics of the galaxy had shifted in a few weeks. The Galactic Council, for all practical purposes, was no longer the institution it had been a month ago. The old structure was still there, the chamber, the balconies, the rules, the procedure. But the weight had moved. Everyone sitting in that chamber could feel it. The center of gravity had shifted, and it had shifted toward Earth, and no vote or formal statement was going to shift it back. The request came in on a standard diplomatic frequency, encoded in formal Veldrath state language, addressed to the office of Secretary-General Insu. It was a ceasefire request. Insu read it once, set it on his desk, and spent the next 3 hours in a meeting with Murray and Tiho and Kangho, who joined through a secure channel from the fleet. The meeting was not about whether to grant the ceasefire. The answer to that question was already clear. A ceasefire cost nothing and allowed Earth to dictate the conditions of what came after from a position of complete advantage. The meeting was about what those conditions were going to look like, and how they were going to be enforced in a way that lasted. He granted the ceasefire 6 hours after receiving the request. Then he sent his terms. The document was 41 pages long. It had taken a team of 12 people working without adequate sleep for 3 weeks to produce, because they had known this moment was coming from the day the fleet left port, and they had wanted to be ready for it with something that was not improvised. Every page was precise. Every clause had been reviewed by military advisors, legal scholars, economists, and analysts who understood alien politics. Nothing in it was punitive simply for the satisfaction of being punitive. Everything in it served a specific and clear purpose. The Veldrath High Speaker and the enforcers who had carried out Junho's execution were to be turned over for criminal trial, not a Veldrath internal proceeding, not a council trial run by existing member species through existing mechanisms that had failed once already. A new tribunal, operating under a founding charter written by Earth and co-signed by the Orani Collective, with legal procedures built on human international law and adapted where necessary for galactic application. The tribunal's authority to indict and to sentence was not subject to veto by any council body. The Veldrath military was to be reduced to 30% of its pre-war strength within 18 months of the treaty's signing. Verification of this reduction was to be conducted by a joint oversight team with unrestricted inspection rights. Any military construction above the agreed threshold required prior notification and approval from a new permanent monitoring body. Reparations were not financial. They were material-specific raw resources extracted from specific Veldrath-controlled systems, delivered according to a detailed schedule that had been calculated by economists, not soldiers, and they were paid not only to Earth. They were distributed to every species that had suffered measurable disruption, economic harm, or collateral impact from the conflict, according to a formula that Earth's analysts had worked out to the decimal. This clause had been Insu's personal addition, argued for in the planning sessions against quiet objection from 2 of his advisors who thought it added unnecessary complexity to an already large document. "We are not doing this for revenge," Insu had said. "We are doing it for structure. Every civilization in this galaxy needs to understand that when someone burns a diplomat, the cost is not paid only by the species strong enough to respond. Everyone pays, and everyone sees that they pay. That is how it stops happening." The advisors had agreed and stopped objecting. The 4 species who had conspired with the Veldrath were handled differently from the Veldrath themselves. There was no military action against any of them. There were no economic sanctions in the traditional sense of closed markets or blocked trade routes. Instead, they were placed under a mandatory transparency requirement, full disclosure of their communications infrastructure, their intelligence operations, and their diplomatic records going back 20 years, to be monitored continuously by a human-chaired oversight committee with complete access rights and the formal authority to flag irregularities for international review. Their secrets were now in humanity's hands. That was not designed to hurt them in the short term. It was designed to last. The Veldrath High Speaker sent his representatives to negotiate the tribunal clause 6 times over 4 days. Each proposal that arrived offered some modification, reduced sentencing guidelines, restricted jurisdictional scope, an appeals process that ran through existing council mechanisms, a timeline that pushed proceedings years into the future. Each proposal was received by Earth's diplomatic office and rejected within 2 hours. No counteroffer was made. No explanation was given for the rejection beyond the simple fact of it. On the 5th day, the tribunal clause was accepted unchanged. Heian came to the private briefing with Insu and Murray carrying a summary document, and the particular careful expression of someone who has been thinking about something uncomfortable for a long time and has decided to say it clearly. She walked through 3 weapons systems her division had developed during the conflict, technologies that had never been deployed in any engagement, that existed only in testing facilities and in her team's research files, and that represented a significant step beyond anything currently in Earth's active military capability or anywhere close to it. She described their capabilities in technical, factual terms. She used no dramatic language. When she finished describing them, she paused. Then she recommended, without hesitation, that all 3 be classified at the highest level immediately and never deployed under any foreseeable circumstances. Insu asked her why. "Because we won without them," she said. "We won this war cleanly, with weapons the galaxy can understand and a strategy they can track and a conduct record they can examine. If we deploy those 3 systems now, we change what this war means. Right now it means we responded to something terrible, and we did it in a way that is proportionate enough for other species to accept and even respect, even if they are afraid of us. If we show those weapons, we become something they cannot measure, something they cannot accept, and fear without any limit in it does not create stability." Murray was watching her carefully. "You are afraid of what we might become," Murray said. "I am afraid," Heian said, "of what we might decide we are allowed to become. Those are different things. The first is a feeling, the second is a choice." The weapons were classified. Insu signed the order himself that afternoon. The restructuring of the Galactic Council was a complicated process that took 3 months and had to be paused twice when old grievances between member species surfaced unexpectedly in the middle of procedural discussions. It moved forward anyway, slowly and with friction, because the alternative, a council with no real enforcement mechanism, and no accountability for what its members did to each other or to species trying to join, was something every attending civilization had just watched the cost of in real time. Humanity held co-chair status alongside the Orani Collective. The human representative to that position was Ara. She had not sought the appointment and had not expected it. Insu had asked her in a conversation that lasted less than 10 minutes, in which he explained his thinking in the direct and brief way he approached everything. She had been in the chamber when it happened. She had survived it and come home and testified precisely, and without self-pity. She understood both the full weight of what had taken place and the specific nature of the work that still needed to be done, and there was no one else he trusted to hold both of those things at the same time without one overwhelming the other. He asked if she was willing. She said she was. Her first act as co-chair was not a policy decision or a structural reform or a statement of position. She submitted a single formal request to the Council's maintenance authority that a small inscription be placed in the floor of the Grand Spire chamber in the exact location where Junho had died. His full name, his diplomatic title, the date, nothing else added, nothing else explained. The request was approved unanimously by every member species present, No debate was required. No member asked for clarification or modification. The inscription took 2 days to complete. When it was finished, Ara went to look at it alone, late in the evening after the day's sessions had ended and the chamber had emptied out and the lights had been turned down to their overnight setting. The grand spire was large and cold and very quiet at that hour. The high ceiling disappeared into shadow above her. The curved balconies were all dark. The room that had held the most powerful representatives of 23 species, that morning now held nothing but space and silence. She stood over the inscription for a long time. She did not speak. There was nothing she needed to say to him that had not already been said, either at the memorial, or in the 12 minutes she had stood at the front of the room and talked about who he had been before all of this, or in the 41 pages of terms that bore, in their shape and their intent, the clear mark of the kind of person who believes that civilization is something you build carefully and protect at genuine cost. The cost had been him. She placed one hand on the inscription. The stone was cold and smooth. On the other side of the station, Admiral Kangho stood on the observation deck of the Undying Soul, watching through the wide viewport as a convoy of Veldrath vessels moved through the system at regulated speed under human escort. It was the first reparation shipment, raw materials from the Veldrath outer systems, bound for distribution according to the treaty's schedule. It was an ordinary thing, logistically, cargo moving from one place to another. But it was the specific cargo and the specific direction that made it what it was. Captain Yuna appeared beside him without announcement, holding 2 cups of the terrible coffee the ship's galley reliably produced. She handed him one. He took it without looking away from the viewport. They stood without speaking for a while. "Do you think he would have wanted this?" Kangho asked eventually. Yuna held her coffee cup and looked at the convoy. "I think he wanted what he always wanted," she said. "A future where no diplomat from any species has to wonder if they'll make it home. He just couldn't have known he'd be the one who paid for it." The convoy moved on through the dark space between stars, running lights blinking small and steady, carrying its weight in the direction the treaty specified. Humanity had not come to the galaxy looking for war. They had come looking for a seat at the table, for real allies, for the kind of future that Junho had spent 22 years working toward with patience and care, and an honest belief that it was possible and worth the effort. They had given up trade rights and limited their military presence and swallowed insults that would have meant war from any other species, because they believed the work mattered and the goal was worth the cost of getting there slowly. And when that wasn't enough, when the thing that happened, in front of every camera and every delegate and every species watching from every system, they had shown something else. Something that had always been present, quiet and ready, underneath all the patience and the careful diplomatic language and the years of asking nicely. They had shown what happened when the line was finally crossed. Not anger, not grief in its raw form, not revenge in the way that word usually means something emotional and hot. Something older and heavier and more permanent than any of those things. The understanding, carried now by every species in the galaxy, that some costs would be paid, some lines would be enforced, and some things would not be forgotten, not from hatred, but from the clear and settled knowledge that certain things must never be allowed to happen a second time. The galaxy had been searching for a word for this since the first moment Earth went silent. It was the same word they had settled on then, and it still fit now, watching the convoy move and the stars hold still, and the inscription cool in the empty chamber where one man had stood with his hands open and changed everything. Certainty.